At the will reading, my daughter-in-law laughed. She's getting nothing. The lawyer laughed too, then read my name first. The smell of coffee and old paper clung to the air the morning they summoned me to Arthur Klein's office. 2 weeks had passed since Ben's funeral, and I still caught myself setting out 2 cups at breakfast. The invitation said it was a preliminary inheritance discussion. I thought it was a courtesy, a formality before the official reading. I wore my black coat, polished Ben's old wedding band on my finger, and took the bus downtown. When I arrived, Lydia's laughter echoed down the hallway before I even reached the door. Her voice was sharp and cold, like glass being cut. "She actually showed up," she sneered. "Guess she wants to see for herself that she's getting nothing." I froze in the doorway. She was sitting beside my son, Ethan, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Her lipstick was too bright for a widow's mourning. "Good morning," I said softly. She didn't reply. She turned to Ethan, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Honey, tell her to wait outside. This is for the family." "She is family," Arthur said evenly from behind his desk. Lydia smirked. "Was." Then she crossed her legs, the diamond on her shoe flashing in the light. Ethan avoided my eyes. "Mom, you look tired. You really didn't have to come. Dad's affairs are being handled. You can just trust us." "Trust," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Your father taught me to read every contract before signing anything." Lydia let out a fake laugh. "Oh, don't worry, Bella. The only thing you'll be signing is your name off the deed. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening." Arthur cleared his throat. "We'll begin the formal review next week, once the certification arrives." Lydia's smile widened. "Oh, that won't be necessary," she said sweetly. "We've already spoken to you about streamlining the process, haven't we?" She reached into her purse, and I caught a glimpse of a golden envelope. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I told you," Lydia whispered to Ethan, not caring that I could hear. "A thick enough envelope makes anyone remember whose name to read first." Ethan nodded slightly, pretending calm, though his knee bounced under the table. He looked like his father when lying. I sat quietly, my hands folded over my lap, and felt the sting behind my ribs. My son. My only son. Lydia leaned forward, voice dripping with triumph. "You see, Bella, people like Arthur appreciate efficiency. It's better for everyone if we make sure the estate goes where it belongs. You've had a long life. Now it's our turn." I stared at her painted smile. "And where do you think it belongs?" "With us," she said, smiling too wide. "Ben wanted his legacy to be in capable hands. You can't even manage a credit card without asking for help." Ethan exhaled through his nose, like he was tired of the conversation already. "Mom, please, don't make this hard. Lydia just means that Dad wanted me to continue the business. You'll have your pension, the house Ben and I built," I said quietly. Lydia interrupted. "A house you can't even climb the stairs in anymore." She tilted her head, pretending sympathy. "We'll find you a nice apartment near a park. With all that inheritance, you won't need to worry about rent." "What inheritance?" I asked. "You just said." "Oh, that's right," she said sweetly. "None." The word landed like a slap. Arthur shifted in his chair, discomfort flickering across his face. Lydia misread it as compliance. "Don't look so guilty," she said to him. "You'll be compensated well for your professionalism." Ethan's phone buzzed. He looked down, muttered something about meetings, then stood. "Mom, we'll talk later. This isn't the place." "It never is," I said. He froze but didn't look back. Lydia stood too, tugging his sleeve. "Come on, darling, we have dinner reservations. Let the poor thing rest. She's had enough shocks for a lifetime." I rose slowly, gripping Ben's wedding band with my thumb. "Ben never did like shortcuts," I said. Lydia laughed, her voice like breaking ice. "He's not here to complain anymore." I watched them walk out arm in arm, leaving a faint trace of expensive perfume and arrogance behind. Arthur stayed seated, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Shore," he said quietly, "please don't worry. Next week we'll settle everything." Arthur's tone grew heavy, deliberate. "You've known my husband 30 years, I said. You know what he stood for?" He nodded once. "I do." I looked down at his desk, where a sealed brown envelope sat, stamped with Ben's initials. My heart clenched. I wanted to ask, but he slid it gently into a drawer. "You'll see soon enough," he said. Outside, the autumn air cut through my coat. The sky was bruised gray, and the wind smelled like rain. As I walked to the bus stop, I passed a cafe window and saw Lydia inside, raising a glass of wine with Ethan, her laughter echoing through the glass like a dare. They already thought they'd won. They thought they'd buried me along with Ben. But they hadn't read his final chapter. Not yet. When I was younger, people used to call me meticulous, sometimes like it was a compliment, sometimes like it was a curse. I had been an accountant for 35 years before I retired, and numbers were my language. They didn't lie, didn't flatter, and never forgot. Maybe that was why Ethan hated them so much. He'd always preferred charm to arithmetic, promises to proof. After Ben and I retired, we invested a small portion of our savings into Ethan's logistics company. He was bright, ambitious, and for a while it felt like we were helping him build something lasting. But ambition is a hungry thing. It never stops eating until it runs out of food or family. The first time I realized something was wrong, it was a missing entry in the quarterly statement. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my reading glasses slipping down my nose, tracing the columns over and over again. $40,000 had disappeared under a vague note that read, "Short-term equity allocation." I asked Ethan about it that Sunday. He laughed, waved a hand, and said, "Mom, relax. It's an investment, high yield. You wouldn't understand. This is the modern market." Ben frowned. "Your mother understands numbers better than most men I've ever worked with," he said. Ethan rolled his eyes. "Yeah, well, times have changed, Dad. She's still using paper ledgers." I didn't argue. I just smiled, took the file home, and checked it again after dinner. The next morning, I called the bank manager. By Friday, I knew he had taken the company's emergency fund and poured it into speculative stocks. When the market dropped 2 weeks later, his losses nearly bankrupted the company. Ben wanted to confront him publicly, but I begged him not to. I used our joint savings, my half of our retirement account, to refill the company's gap before the auditors came. Ethan never knew how close he had come to losing everything. Or maybe he did, and just chose to forget. A month later, I overheard him tell Lydia on the porch, "She humiliated me. My own mother, always watching me like I'm some kid with sticky fingers." Lydia's voice was soft, poisonous. "Because she doesn't trust you, Ethan. She never has. She treats you like an employee, not a son. Maybe it's time you stop letting her control your life." I remember standing behind the curtain, the lace brushing my hand, wondering how love could sound so much like betrayal when spoken through a whisper. After that, things changed quickly. Lydia began finding new ways to draw lines through our house. She moved Ben's photo from the mantel to the hallway, replaced my floral tablecloths with marble gray ones, and started calling our home the Shore property. She wanted ownership of everything she touched, including the air. One night, while clearing dinner plates, she looked straight at me and said, "I don't know how you manage to look so calm when everyone knows Ethan carries you. Without him, you'd be living off coupons." I wanted to tell her about the silent transfer I'd made to save Ethan's company, the one I'd kept secret even from Ben, but I didn't, because I knew people like Lydia saw kindness as weakness and truth as ammunition. Ben noticed, of course. He always did. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sky bleed orange into night, he reached over and took my hand. His skin was warm, steady. "They think you're meddling," he said softly. "They don't understand you're protecting them." I laughed without humor. "Maybe I've overstepped." "No," he said, shaking his head. "If you hadn't, Ethan would have lost everything." He fell quiet for a moment, then added, "But Bella, I'm not blind. Lydia's changed him. She's clever, but cold. If I go before you, promise me something." I looked at him, the light fading behind his shoulders. "What?" "Don't trust words," he said. "Trust signatures." I didn't understand it then, not fully. But the way he said it made the air feel heavier, like a prophecy hanging between us. Months passed. Ben's health began to decline quietly at first, then sharply. Lydia insisted on managing his medication, saying the nurses were too expensive. I noticed she always kept the cabinet locked, even when I needed my own pills. She'd hand me my prescription with that same smile that never touched her eyes. Ethan grew distant, caught between guilt and pride, visiting his father less, talking more about expansion and partnerships. "You and Dad wouldn't understand," he told me one night when I asked him to slow down. "The world doesn't wait for people who count pennies." "No," I said, "but it remembers who borrowed them." He stormed off, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the walls. Ben passed on a cold Sunday morning. Lydia cried the loudest, her voice echoing through the church like she'd lost a limb. Ethan stood stiff beside her, not looking at me. I kept hearing Ben's last words over and over again: trust signatures. After the funeral, I found a sealed envelope in Ben's desk drawer, initials carved neatly into the wax. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some things need time to reveal themselves. When I heard Lydia tell Ethan 2 weeks later that she had taken care of Arthur, I knew exactly what Ben had meant. She thought she'd bought loyalty. She didn't realize Ben had already purchased truth. And truth, unlike people, cannot be bribed. The morning of the real reading felt nothing like the rehearsal they had staged weeks before. The air inside Klein and Parker was sharp with polish and tension, the kind of chill that made even flowers in the vase stand straight. Lydia arrived first, wearing a white suit that looked too celebratory for a widow. Ethan followed, expensive cologne cutting through the smell of old wood and paper. I sat at the far end of the table, clutching the linen handkerchief Ben used to keep in his pocket. Arthur Klein entered last, the same calm step he'd always had, the weight of 30 years of our family's trust in his briefcase. Lydia leaned over to whisper, her perfume thick enough to sting. "He just needs to read the paper we gave him. Easy money." Ethan smirked. "Let's just get this over with." They didn't even look my way. To them, I was furniture part of the old decor soon to be removed. Arthur adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. "This last will and testament of Benjamin Shore." Ethan nodded at Lydia, the corners of their mouths twitching with satisfaction. But then Arthur's tone changed. "To my beloved wife, Bella Shore," he read slowly, his voice deepening. "I leave the entirety of my estate, all property and accounts, with full legal rights and sole discretion." The air shifted. Silence spread like a ripple. Ethan's smile froze. Lydia's lipstick twitched at the corner. She shot to her feet. "You're reading the wrong version," she snapped. "I have the updated one, signed and notarized just 2 weeks ago." Arthur didn't flinch. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another envelope, the one with Ben's seal pressed into red wax. "You're right," he said evenly. "I do have that version. And I also have a note from Ben himself, recorded the week before he passed." He laid the sealed drive on the table like a verdict. He asked that if anyone presented this updated version, I should give the contents of this file directly to the authorities. Ethan's voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" "My father trusted me with." Arthur looked up, his gaze steady. "He trusted the law." Lydia tried to snatch the papers off the table, but Arthur covered them with one firm hand. "Mrs. Shore," he said to her, calm as stone, "you and your husband offered me a bribe 3 weeks ago. I took it." The room went still, her face drained of color. "But I took it under surveillance. Every dollar is accounted for. Every word you spoke was recorded. Ben anticipated that you two might try this." I felt my breath catch. I didn't know Ben had gone that far, but I wasn't surprised. He'd always played chess when everyone else played cards. Lydia's hands shook. "You can't prove anything," she hissed. "We'll sue you for defamation." Arthur leaned back, almost smiling. "You can try. But before you do, perhaps you should listen to what Ben had to say himself." He turned to me. "Mrs. Shore, he wanted you to be here when I played this." He inserted the flash drive into the projector. The screen flickered to life, and Ben's face appeared tired but sharp-eyed, his voice slow and certain. "If you're hearing this," he said, "then the people I once called family have chosen greed over gratitude. Lydia, Ethan, I warned you both. A name can build an empire, but it can also bury one. This inheritance belongs to the one who built it beside me, not the ones who tried to steal it. Lydia stumbled backward, knocking her chair over. Ethan sat frozen, jaw tight, eyes glassy. Arthur paused the video and turned the lights back on. The air seemed to hum with justice. Ethan finally spoke, low and desperate. "You planned this with him, didn't you?" I met his eyes for the first time in years. "No," I said quietly. "Your father planned it with the truth." Arthur folded the will neatly and slid it into a new folder marked Probate. Filed. "The estate transfer begins immediately," he said. "All holdings, including the company shares, revert to Mrs. Shore. You are welcome to contest, but I'd suggest you check the evidence files first." Lydia's nails scraped the table. "You can't do this. We had everything." Arthur stood, gathering his documents. "You had arrogance," he said. "You mistook it for power." As they stormed out, I stayed seated, listening to their footsteps fade. My hands stopped shaking. The handkerchief in my palm was warm now, as if Ben himself had pressed it there. For years, they had called me weak, old-fashioned, irrelevant, but all I had ever been was patient. And patience, when coupled with truth, can level even the most expensive lies. Arthur turned off the projector. The silence that followed was deafening. Lydia's face was ghost white, her lipstick smudged. Ethan's knuckles were white where they gripped the armrest. You recorded us?" Lydia spat, her voice cracking between fury and disbelief. Arthur adjusted his tie. "Mr. Shore recorded everything," he said evenly. "He suspected you might try to alter his will. I simply followed instructions." He placed a sealed evidence bag on the table. "This copy has already been submitted to the Pennsylvania State Court, along with your bank transfers." Ethan slammed his fist on the table. "You set us up!" Arthur met his gaze, unblinking. "No, Mr. Shore. You set yourselves up when you forgot that the law has a longer memory than greed." Lydia pushed back her chair so hard it screeched against the floor. "We can still fight this. You think some old video will hold up in court?" Arthur leaned forward slightly. "You're welcome to try. Just remember, bribery, forgery, and witness tampering carry separate sentences." I sat there, my pulse steady for the first time in months. I didn't need to gloat. Ben had already done that for me, calmly, elegantly, with proof. The kind of proof that couldn't be denied, erased, or bought. Lydia's eyes darted to me, wild with fury. "You think this makes you some kind of saint?" she hissed. "You were always in the way, controlling, judging, pretending to be better than everyone." I stood slowly. "No," I said. "I just didn't sell what I couldn't buy back my name." Arthur rose from his chair. "This meeting is concluded," he said. "The inheritance stands. The video, the recordings, and the payment trail are now part of the probate record. Any attempt to contest will go directly to federal review." Lydia opened her mouth, but Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. His voice was low, defeated. "Let's go." As they walked out, Arthur turned to me. "He really did plan it all," he said softly. I nodded, tears blurring my sight. "That was Ben," I whispered, always thinking 3 moves ahead. When I stepped outside, the wind was cool against my face. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. And for the first time since Ben's funeral, I felt something like peace, not because justice had come, but because the man I loved had found a way to protect me even from beyond the grave. The courthouse smelled faintly of ink and cold coffee, the kind of air where truth feels heavier than it should. Lydia and Ethan sat across from me, all sharp suits and forced composure. Their lawyer, a smug man with hair too slick to trust, kept whispering directions between clenched teeth. I sat alone at my table, my hands folded on the wooden surface, calm in a way that seemed to unnerve them. Ethan's attorney stood first. "Your Honor," he began, his tone a blend of arrogance and rehearsed outrage. "This is a clear case of manipulation and fraud. My clients were deceived by Miss Arthur Klein and Mrs. Bella Shore into signing documents under false pretenses. Funds were misappropriated, and this so-called will," he lifted a printed copy, shaking it dramatically, "is nothing more than a product of coercion." The judge, A woman with steel-gray eyes and no patience for theatrics raised an eyebrow. "Do you have evidence of coercion, counselor?" The man hesitated. "We believe." "Belief," the judge interrupted, "is not evidence." Arthur, sitting beside me, stood with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to shout. "Your Honor, may I?" She nodded. He opened a thin folder and handed several documents to the clerk. "These are certified bank statements from Shore & Co. and from Mr. Benjamin Shore's private account. They show 3 transfers made over a 2-year period, totaling $1.2 million, all signed and verified by Mr. Shore himself. The funds were legally moved into Mrs. Shore's account, accompanied by notarized memos marked Personal Protection and Care Provision." The clerk passed the documents to the judge. Lydia's lawyer leaned forward, visibly paling. "These could have been fabricated." Arthur smiled slightly, polite but lethal. "Indeed, which is why the bank's vice president is present today as a witness. She will testify that Mr. Shore himself authorized these transfers in person." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lydia's hand shot to Ethan's arm, nails digging into the fabric of his sleeve. "You said he didn't transfer anything," she hissed. He didn't reply. Arthur turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, the defendant's claim that Mrs. Shore stole or conspired is not only false, it is slanderous. The truth is simple. Benjamin Shore ensured his wife's security long before his death. His foresight is the only reason she's sitting here today, instead of being left destitute by her son's greed." The judge scanned the papers, nodding slightly. "It appears everything checks out. These are legitimate, properly recorded transfers. Do you have anything further to add, counselor?" Lydia's lawyer fumbled with his notes. "Your Honor, we maintain that Mrs. Shore manipulated her husband." The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. "Enough. This court does not entertain baseless accusations against the deceased." A hush fell. The only sound was the quiet click of a pen somewhere behind me. The judge looked down at me then, her tone softening. "Mrs. Shore, you've remained silent through most of this hearing. Do you wish to say anything before I make my ruling?" I stood slowly, my knees protesting the movement, but my voice came out steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." Every eye turned toward me. Ethan wouldn't meet my gaze. Lydia smirked faintly, as if expecting one last plea for sympathy. "I don't want to win money," I said. My voice echoed in the stillness. "I've lived most of my life counting other people's numbers, watching people fight over what they can't take with them. Ben and I built our home on honesty, not inheritance. When I found out about the bribery, I didn't feel angry. I felt sorry. Sorry that the people I raised to know better had learned nothing from kindness." I paused, looking at Ethan. He looked older now, his ambition worn thin by panic. "I don't want your apology," I said quietly. "I don't want revenge. I just don't want my name buried next to lies." The judge leaned back, her expression unreadable. After a moment she said, "That's perhaps the most honest thing spoken in this room today." Arthur placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. The gesture said everything words couldn't. Across from us, Lydia folded her arms, seething, her carefully composed facade cracking. "You think this is over?" she whispered harshly. "You ruined our lives." I looked at her, calm as still water. "No," I said. "You did that the moment you tried to sell your soul and overcharged." The judge struck her gavel again. "Case dismissed. All assets confirmed under the original will. Any further appeal will require new evidence, though I advise the defendants to consider what little credibility they have left." Arthur exhaled softly beside me. Ethan slumped back into his chair, staring at nothing. Lydia grabbed her purse, but her shaking hands couldn't find the zipper. As we stepped out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights felt gentler somehow. Arthur smiled faintly. "You handled that beautifully." "I didn't handle anything," I said. "Ben did. I just showed up." Outside, a breeze rolled through the courthouse steps, carrying the sound of traffic and church bells from blocks away. I tilted my face toward the sunlight and whispered, "You were right, Ben. The truth doesn't shout, it waits." Behind us, the doors of the courtroom closed with a solid, final thud. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. It was a quiet morning when I changed the sign. The old brass letters that once read the Shore residence had tarnished, their edges rusted by decades of storms. I stood at the gate, screwdriver in hand, and carefully removed each letter, one by one. Every clang of metal on pavement sounded like a chapter closing. When the new plaque went up, gleaming gold under the pale light, it read, Shore Haven, for forgotten women. The word haven mattered more than shore ever did. For years, this house had been a prison of silence, a place where I learned how greed can turn blood into strangers. Now, it would become what Ben always wanted our home to be, a refuge. Inside, the furniture had been rearranged. The dining table, where Lydia once sneered at my old-fashioned manners, was now stacked with brochures from local charities and elder advocacy groups. The same floor that had echoed with arguments now carried the shuffle of volunteers moving quietly, purposefully. I had turned the inheritance the court returned into something cleaner, something that wouldn't rot the soul. Every Thursday, women began to arrive. Some came in tears, others came carrying plastic grocery bags filled with papers, foreclosure notices, eviction letters, unpaid medical bills. They were mothers, widows, grandmothers, forgotten women. I listened more than I spoke. They told stories of children who drained their savings under the guise of helping, of signatures tricked out of trust, and of retirement accounts emptied in the name of family. Each story burned like a mirror I could barely look into. One afternoon, a young woman came in, couldn't have been more than 25. She held a stack of documents in trembling hands. "Mrs. Shore," she said softly, "my mom, she lost her house. My brother told her it was just a refinance, but he sold it and took everything. She's living in her car now." I gestured to the chair opposite mine. "Sit," I said. "What's your name?" "Emily," she whispered. "She doesn't even want to fight back anymore. Says it's her fault for trusting him." I felt something old and familiar stir in my chest. The same ache I'd felt when I discovered what Ethan and Lydia had done, the disbelief that someone you raised could so easily forget your worth. "Emily," I said, taking her hand, "the world will tell your mother that love means forgiving betrayal. But real love, real dignity, means knowing when to stop letting yourself be buried alive." Her eyes welled up. "What can we do?" I smiled faintly. "We start small, paperwork first, then pressure. I know a few lawyers who still believe in justice, and I have space here she can stay until we fix this." Emily's shoulders shook with quiet relief. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." I looked at her, remembering the night I was told to find my own way. How cold the air had been, how hollow the faces around me. "Because someone once left me alone too," I said softly. "And because justice doesn't retire, dear, it just changes its address." For a moment, the house was silent. Then, from the hallway, I heard laughter, two of the volunteers unpacking donated clothes, joking about a sweater too hideous to save. It was such a simple sound, but it filled the space like sunlight after a long storm. That evening, as the last visitors left, I stood on the porch with a mug of tea. The sign gleamed in the fading light, the gold letters catching the sunset like fire. Shore Haven, a place reborn. Arthur visited later that week, carrying a folder under his arm and that same patient smile. "You've turned this house into something remarkable," he said. "It's not mine anymore," I replied. "It belongs to the women who come through that gate. They're the real shareholders of this place." He chuckled. "Ben would have loved that." I glanced toward the garden, where a small memorial stone stood under the rose bush we'd planted together years ago. "He always said, 'Wealth isn't what you keep,'" I murmured. "It's what you leave standing when you're gone." Arthur nodded, his voice soft. "And you've made sure that what stands carries his name and your strength." When he left, the night was thick with crickets and the hum of the town beyond. I locked the door, turned off the porch light, and paused at the entryway. The faint scent of lavender polish lingered in the air. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel empty. In the hallway, I whispered to Ben's photograph, "We're still helping people, love, just like you wanted." The wind outside rustled the curtains as if to answer. And in that stillness, I realized something. The story of the Shore family was no longer a tragedy. It was a blueprint, not for vengeance, but for rebuilding. Where greed had broken walls, kindness had built doors. And the name on the gate, Shore Haven, finally meant what it always should have. A place where forgotten women remember themselves again. The lights in the studio were almost too bright, the kind that made every line on your face show its story. I sat there, hands folded neatly on my lap, the microphone clipped to my blouse, the logo of Good Morning America glowing behind the host's perfect hair and perfect smile. "Mrs. Shore," she began, her tone that soft mix of curiosity and admiration. "The footage from that will reading went viral, 40 million views and counting. The world saw your daughter-in-law laugh and say, 'She's getting nothing.' Then the lawyer read your name first. What went through your mind in that moment?" I looked at her, calm, steady. The studio was silent, except for the faint hum of the cameras. "Honestly," I said, "that I'd rather be laughed at once than live a life that's the punchline." A few people in the crew chuckled quietly. The host smiled wider, leaning in. "And yet, you forgave them?" I thought for a moment. "Forgiveness," I said, "isn't about pretending it didn't happen. It's about refusing to let their ugliness take up space in your soul. They lost money. I lost family. But only one of us learned something." The host nodded, visibly moved. "You turned that pain into purpose, founding Shore Haven, a refuge for women cheated out of their savings or homes by their own children. That's extraordinary." "It's ordinary kindness," I replied. "We just forget how powerful that can be." When the interview ended, the audience applauded softly. A young producer whispered, "You're trending again, Mrs. Shore." I smiled. Justice has good timing. Outside, New York glimmered in the early afternoon sun. I clutched my coat tighter as a breeze swept past. The car was waiting, but I told the driver to take me to the airport instead of the hotel. At the terminal, everything felt strangely familiar. The echo of rolling suitcases, the scent of coffee and jet fuel, the low murmur of people rushing toward gates and destinations. A year ago, this place had been my humiliation. Ethan and Lydia's laughter, still somewhere in the air if I listened hard enough. Now, it felt like a full circle. At the counter, the attendant took my ticket. "First class to Rome, Mrs. Shore," she said with a cheerful smile. "Traveling alone today?" I met her eyes and smiled back. "Not really," I said. "My dignity's coming with me." She laughed, genuine and warm. "That's the best kind of company." Boarding the plane, I felt the strange weightlessness of freedom, not from flying, but from the absence of bitterness. When you've already lost everything false, what's left is finally real. As I settled into my seat, the stewardess offered champagne. I accepted, watching the clouds stretch across the horizon. Somewhere below, Lydia and Ethan were probably still trying to rebuild what money couldn't buy: respect. I wished them peace, but I didn't need their apology. The universe had already written the ending in ink too thick to erase. The engines roared softly. The plane began to roll. The city fell away beneath us: tiny streets, toy buildings, the river glinting like a silver thread. I thought of Ben then, of his hands building our porch swing, of the smell of sawdust and rain. "You were right, love," I whispered under my breath. "The truth outlives the noise." As we lifted through the clouds, sunlight spilled across the window, washing everything in gold. Somewhere between sky and earth, I realized I was finally unburdened, not victorious, not vengeful, just free. And as the camera of life seemed to pull back, the final image settled in my mind: a small, aging woman in seat 1A, watching the world unfold below her, a soft smile playing on her lips. It had been 2 years since the trial, though sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago, and other times like it had just happened yesterday. The headlines had long faded, the reporters had stopped calling, and the world had moved on. But grief, real grief, doesn't follow schedules. It lingers quietly, in the spaces between what was and what remains. That morning, the air smelled like rain, and the roses Ben planted were in bloom again. Their color had deepened over the years, a fierce, stubborn red that refused to fade. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, when Arthur's car pulled into the driveway. He still drove the same old Lincoln, though it coughed more than it used to. He climbed the steps slowly, a brown envelope in hand. "You didn't have to drive all the way here, Arthur," I said. "You could have just mailed it." He smiled faintly. "This one deserves a hand delivery." He handed me the envelope, stamped with Ben's initials B.S., in that same looping signature that once filled tax forms, letters, and love notes. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced it. "What is this?" Arthur hesitated. "It's the last thing he left. We found it while finalizing the foundation paperwork. It was sealed with instructions to give it to you after the first anniversary of Shore Haven." I blinked. "He planned that too?" Arthur chuckled softly. "Bella, I'm beginning to think Ben planned the next century." He left soon after, leaving me alone with the envelope. I waited a long time before opening it. Some letters aren't meant to be rushed. Inside, there were two things: a handwritten letter and a small brass key tied to a ribbon. The paper was thick, old-fashioned, and smelled faintly of cedar, his scent. I unfolded it slowly, my heart beating in the quiet like a metronome. "My dearest Bella, if you're reading this, it means Shore Haven stands, and that you did what I always knew you would: turn pain into purpose. I used to joke that you could balance the universe with a pencil and a ledger book, but truth is, you always balanced me. You kept us honest when the world tempted shortcuts. By now, you've seen the worst of people, maybe even of our own blood. But I hope you've also seen that truth outlives deceit, and kindness outlives shame. The world might remember my name on a will, but I want them to remember yours on something living. That's what this key is for. It opens the old storage unit by the pier in Harrisburg, the one we used to keep the boat in. You always said the river smelled like work, not rest. Maybe now it can smell like both. Inside, you'll find the ledger from my first company, every investment, every note, every mistake I ever made. Donate it when you're ready. Maybe some young fool will learn from an old man's errors. One more thing. There's a tin box in that locker marked, 'For her eyes only.' Don't laugh. You'll understand when you see it. I'll end this before the ink blots again. You always said I press too hard when I write. Guess I never learned to be gentle where you're concerned. Thank you for keeping our name honest, Bella. And if heaven has a good accountant, I'll make sure your name's at the top of the list. With love that never retires, Ben." The tears came before I even finished the last line. Not the kind that burn or sob, just quiet ones that fall because the heart doesn't know where else to put the ache. I pressed the letter to my chest, letting it stay there until the paper warmed against my skin. Later that afternoon, I took the key and drove to Harrisburg. The road wound along the river, and every mile felt like stepping backward through time. The storage unit was smaller than I remembered, the paint chipped, the padlock stiff from disuse. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil and old rope. Sunlight filtered through a crack in the roof, illuminating a stack of ledgers, boxes, and just as he'd said, a small tin box labeled, "For her eyes only." I sat on the floor, cross-legged like a child, and opened it. Inside was a folded map, a faded photograph of us on our wedding day, and a small velvet pouch. When I tipped it open, a gold locket fell into my palm. Inside the locket was a single line of engraving: "The truth will always find its accountant." I laughed, a real, startled laugh that echoed in the hollow space. Trust Ben to make philosophy sound like bookkeeping. Beneath the locket was a note, smaller, almost an afterthought. "If you ever doubt yourself, look in the mirror and remember the woman staring back built an empire out of honesty." That night, back at Shore Haven, I placed the locket in a glass case on the mantel. The women staying at the house noticed it during dinner. One of them, Margaret, a widow who'd lost her home to her son's gambling debts, asked, "What's that?" "A reminder," I said, smiling softly. "That truth might take its time, but it always arrives on schedule." The next morning, I started a new program through the Foundation-free financial literacy classes for widows and retirees. I called it the Ledger Project. It wasn't glamorous, but it was what Ben would have wanted. Women learning to read contracts, recognize red flags, and never sign their names off the deeds of their lives again. As months passed, Shorehaven grew. The walls, once filled with silence, now hummed with life, laughter, debate, even music. One of the women brought an old record player, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, we'd dance in the living room, bare feet sliding across the wooden floors. There were no tears left in that house, only stories, stories stitched together with survival and second chances. One evening, a letter arrived, addressed simply to Mrs. Bella Shore. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. Inside was a short note from Ethan. "Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm working at a mechanic's shop now, honest work. Lydia left. Maybe that's for the best. I've been sober 9 months. I keep thinking about what you said in court. That you didn't want revenge. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. I don't deserve Shorehaven. But if you ever need someone to fix the fence or mow the lawn, I'll come. No charge this time. Ethan." I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. Instead, I set the letter under a paperweight shaped like a compass, Ben's old one. I whispered, "He's finding north again." A week later, I hired a new groundskeeper. When he showed up, sunburned and quiet, I handed him a set of gloves and pointed to the rose garden. "They bite," I warned. "But they bloom." He smiled, that same crooked half-smile Ben used to have when something hurt, but he pretended it didn't. For a long time, we worked in silence. The sound of pruning shears and rustling leaves was all the language we needed. As dusk fell, I looked around Shorehaven, the women laughing on the porch, the lights in the kitchen, the smell of bread baking. The world had changed, yes, but somehow it had come full circle. Sometimes, at night, when the wind carried the sound of trains in the distance, I'd take out Ben's locket and open it under the lamp. The engraving caught the light, and I'd whisper, "The truth always finds its accountant. Love, even when it takes the long route." And I realized something. Justice isn't the end of a story, it's the start of a better one. That evening, before heading to bed, I wrote a new letter, not for lawyers, not for courts, but for the women who would inherit Shorehaven someday. To whoever finds this house after I'm gone, don't let it become a museum. Let it stay messy, loud, full of laughter and tears. Teach the women who come here that power doesn't come from inheritance, it comes from integrity. If anyone tries to take that from you, remember what an old widow once proved in court. Honesty doesn't age, and neither does courage. Bella Shore, founder of Shorehaven. The next morning, I placed the letter in the tin box beside Ben's note and locked it again. When I stepped outside, the sunrise spilled over the horizon, painting the sign out front in gold. Shorehaven, for forgotten women. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of birds waking and cars passing on the distant road. Then I whispered into the wind, "Ben, we did good." The breeze stirred, soft and warm, as if answering. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the last chapter of a story. I felt like the beginning of a legacy. And that was my story. A story about how a widow found her strength in the ruins of betrayal, and how the truth, when you let it breathe, can outlive every lie whispered against you. If you've listened all the way here, thank you truly. Stories like mine aren't just about revenge. They're about dignity, about women who refuse to be erased. And if you believe those stories matter, if you believe justice, even quiet justice, still deserves to be heard, then don't leave yet. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories and hit that hype button to keep our voices alive. Every click helps bring another forgotten grandmother's story out of silence and into the light. Because in this world, justice never retires. It just grows older, wiser, and louder.